This episode is brought to you by Pure 39, empowering CTV advertisers with comprehensive pre-bid and reporting solutions for targeting and brand suitability. Why settle for non-transparent CTV campaigns when you can select the channels, content, and genres your ad will run on? With over 2,000 CTV signals to apply and report on, you'll be able to customize your targeting, suitability, and optimizations directly in your DSP of choice. If you're looking for more control of your CTV buys, visit pure39.com/CTV. That's PEER39.com/CTV to learn more. This podcast is brought to you by Moloko. Moloko is a trusted and transparent advertising platform powered by machine learning. Moloko can drive the best outcomes for mobile app advertising through Moloko ads as experienced by marquee brands like Bumble, DraftKings, and Playrix. For retailers and streaming enterprises, Moloko also provides an advertising platform powered by machine learning to build and manage their own ad businesses. Learn more at moloko.com/podcast. That's moloko.com/podcast. Welcome to the Marketecture Podcast. We have a great show today. A person who's had probably more impact on the digital advertising market than anyone else I know, Randall Rothenberg, the CEO emeritus of the IAB. We'll be talking about the kind of history of what's happened with that organization, as well as some of the battles over things like Do Not Track and other things like that. So I'm really excited about that conversation. Also, a lot of news like News Corp suing Perplexity. So we'll be talking about that, probably one in many suits to come. We had pretty big news this week, though, which is that the Marketecture family expanded. We acquired AdTech Explained. AdTech Explained, if you don't read it, is the best written articles about ad tech that exist. Like, if you think my newsletter is fun and jaunty, I'm a little bit loose on the facts. AdTech Explained is buttoned up. It gives you the facts, exactly how things work with all the details, even code samples. It's once a month. It's free. I would highly recommend going to adtechexplained.com and signing up. Also, this week, we put out a pod on the Monopoly Report with Terry Kawaja, and Terry talked about Lena Khan and how some of the stuff she's doing is fantastic and other stuff is really cramping his style, as well as the Google spin out and what it might be valued at. So the Monopoly Report is a separate podcast from this one. Sometimes we have bonus episodes here, but you need to subscribe to it separately. So go to Spotify, YouTube, Apple TV, and smash that subscribe button. All right, Randall Rothenberg, thank you so much for deigning us with your presence. We're excited to have you.
It is a pleasure to be here, Ari.
And Eric Franchi, as always, thank you for supporting this pod.
I'm happy to be here, as always. Hey, R2.
Hey, Eric, it is a pleasure to see you in your big glasses again.
Eric has very large glasses, just for the listeners out there. So, Randall, are you retired? Like, how's retirement going?
I'm certainly retired from IAB, without question. Retirement is going fantastically. It's a very interesting experience. The most interesting part of it is just simply the recognition that this is a terminal experience, that this is what I will be for the rest of my life.
Wow, that's one way to put it. I think there's better ways to put it. Like, this is the final chapter, the phase. Maybe that's not better. I don't know.
It's not going. I don't see that going in the right direction.
All right, let's talk about the IAB. So you had quite a run, and I think 13, 14 years there. First of all, like, why'd you take the job? It's a weird job to have, the head of an industry trade organization. How'd they find you? Because you were in publishing, and why'd you take the job?
Well, I mean, I wasn't in publishing at the time. I was working at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is, a giant consulting firm. I went into Booz in 1999 in what was essentially a publishing role. But then I served most of my years there. I was chief marketing officer, and I had also the lofty title of senior director of intellectual capital. So I was in charge of research and, analytics, as well as a whole publishing enterprise across, various media. But then I also spent like my last, I think 2 years there, maybe 3 years, 30% of my time was in the media practice. I mean, I was actually doing client work. And that's pretty much how I ended up getting to IAB. I had done, going back to 1999, a lot of work. In fact, they hired me because I knew a fair amount of what was then called e-business, if you remember that period. I knew a fair amount the firm needed to become much more competitive in that area, not just for clients, but very importantly, in the 1999, 2000 timeframe for recruits, who are getting, bleeding off into this fancy new tech world. So I had a fair amount of experience at Booz Allen working in internet related matters. A lot of it was for media companies and Salesforce reorganization. And so I'd met a fair number of people that way. We were the first consulting firm that Google had hired, for example.
Google hired a consulting firm?
Google, Tim Armstrong hired us. I'm trying to remember if it was 2000, 2001. It was pretty early. For the way I recalled the engagement was to do a map of Madison Avenue. But what that actually meant was Tim knew that there were going to be limits to the ability to grow their search advertising business. So he was very early on in fact, I think he got hired for this, to build a display advertising business and to build a robust display advertising business. You wanted to get to the 200, 300, 500 largest advertisers.
Sure.
So that's where he came in, and that began my direct involvement with Google.
So fast forward, how did you get the job?
How did I get the job?
Or why'd you take the job? Either way.
Why'd I take the job? There were a couple of reasons. I'd say the most honest and proximate one was I'd had a charmed life at Booz Allen. I'd never had more authority, more freedom to do what I wanted. And then around, I guess it was 2006 or thereabouts, we went through a giant reorganization, and I knew that was going to be very infelicitous for me in my future. I was not going to have the enjoyable, charmed, productive life that I'd had there. And this came along. So that was one. The second was I had a significant idea of, what was needed. No, in fact, I'll tell you, it goes back to Tim again. I'd forgotten this. I got the call from the headhunter when I was actually out at, I think it was the second Google Zeitgeist conference. And I got the call from the headhunter. It was in the hotel. I walked down into the lobby and there's Tim. And I go, hey, I just got the most interesting call from a headhunter, looking for a new CEO for the IAB. And Tim said, I know. And I said, oh, okay, well, let me ask you. I've obviously never run a trade association before, but in my career, I've been around a bunch of trade associations. And my observation is that a trade association could specialize in one or two of a half dozen different specialties. I mean, you could be a hiring hall. You could be a lobbying, public policy organization. Right. You could be a standard setting body. So I said to Tim, what is it for IAB? And without missing a beat, he said, thought leadership, hands down. I thought, okay, well, that's the job I've just had. So I can do that. I can imagine that. And I said, but Tim, why do you say that? Why is that the issue? And he said, because thought leadership is what gets people into the room. Once you've got them in the room, you can coalesce them to do the right thing for the industry. And I just thought that was such a clear path, and it was so relevant to what I had done. And it was really interesting to me because the internet industry, such as it was, I thought was this just kind of vast well of creative opportunity, for people who are interested in, I'll use this phrase very broadly, people who are interested in saying things not just by voice, but by sound, by visuals, storytelling, narratives, journalism, film. So I just thought, oh man, this is a wide open field.
Well, so did it turn out that way, that thought leadership was what you spent your time on? Because I think there was a lot more. There was lobbying, there was politics, there was standard setting, there was a lot more than that.
Yeah. But if you take, a step back from this thing, the entire business being trade association business, the entire business is premised on two or three overarching things. One of them is thought leadership, defined as bringing important, interesting, and ideally legitimate ideas to the forefront about how an industry, companies within that industry, individuals within those companies could advance their lives and livelihood. So that is central to what you do. The other things that then come into play there are, of course, that notion of coalescing, of decision making, getting people to try and come together and do the right thing for others. I used to call it civic self-interest. So those two things together are actually very, very, very interesting because, you come up with ideas, you work with people to develop ideas that you think are legitimate and important, but then you got to get people to adopt those ideas. And that's a different skill set.
What's fascinating to me about your run, which started, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2007 and ended in 2020?
Yeah. Well, no, it ended after that because, I didn't formally retire until early 2023. But yeah, I left the CEO position in 2020. Right.
So if I think back to 2007, it's like, AOL, MSN, Yahoo are the largest sellers of digital advertising. Right around the corner is the birth of the ad exchange. Right around the corner is the birth of data and programmatic. And then you see mobile and social. And then, really fast forward, you've got the duopoly or the triopoly. I mean, you saw it all.
Yeah.
What stands out to you is like the most pivotal moments, the most pivotal times?
Well, I would have to say, retrospectively, number one is Google buying DoubleClick, or actually announcing, is even more important, announcing its intent to acquire DoubleClick, which I think was June 2007, because that launched a lot of things. The most obvious, I think, to the people who are going to be listening to this is, of course, the consolidation of the industry and the technologization of advertising. But a little less obvious, but still quite profound internally, is it launched the privacy wars, where, in effect, the entire competitive basis, and I'm not exaggerating, the entire competitive foundation of the industry became a form of regulatory arbitrage. Companies, large companies or coalitions of smaller companies trying to use the regulatory system and regulatory mechanisms to subvert the competitive abilities of their competitors. So that certainly stands out. And I think we even knew it at the time. In fact, we did know it at the time. I remember talking to Microsoft because I think it was a day after, couldn't have been much longer than that, started getting calls from Microsoft or its minions that were really about opposing this deal.
Well, also, in addition to the deal, there were folks who said Google shouldn't be allowed in IAB meetings. They shouldn't be a member, right?
I did not face that when I was being hired, and I didn't face that for a couple of years. That really didn't happen. Now, it had been happening, but I don't think it was premised on Google as much. I mean, you mentioned that the industry was dominated at that point by, Yahoo, AOL, to a degree, MSN. OPA had been formed by IAB people before I got there. But I don't think Google was so much the focus at that time. And so it didn't cross my desk. And in fact, Martin Nisenholtz, who was one of the founders of OPA, was also on the search committee for IAB that hired me. So the relationships and the politics and the opposition were somewhat more fluid and, I guess, less focused at that point.
But I think your point that it was a multi-front battle that was not always clear who was on what sides is pretty relevant here. I want to specifically target one of my favorite topics. The reason I had the idea to bring you on the pod is because you and I were on the one train. We had both spoken at Columbia and we're heading downtown. And you said to me, somewhat unprompted, that the real issue is that browsers should be regulated. And I totally agree. That is the hottest hot take. And I totally agree. So can you take me through the do not track wars and what happened and your involvement?
Well, I'm not sure if I can, do it completely coherently or in a kind of linear fashion.
Sure. Just your perspective of what happened.
I mean, I'd say if you want to start in a kind of a top line, umbrella statement that colors everything here or under which everything else hangs, it's all about economic competition between and among players. And the curiosity, and some might even say perversity, of trade associations is that they are coalitions of competitors.
Right.
It's companies that want to beat each other's brains out. And what happens in most industries certainly in mature ones. But what happens in most industries, I think, is that those competitors get together and they either actively decide or tacitly decide, we're going to put our economic competition to the side while we're inside these four walls in order to accomplish civic goals that will benefit all of us, create, some kind of level playing field so our competition can take place on open and, I'm going to use a loaded word here, legitimate grounds. With IAB, possibly because the internet advertising industry was so new, possibly because the technology evolves so rapidly, probably a bunch of other reasons as well. You both had that, okay, we'll put our stuff aside here so we can take care of the big stuff. But you also had this kind of just ongoing, am I allowed to swear, by the way?
Sure.
You had this ongoing thing of, let's fuck those other guys, let's use whatever mechanisms we have to make sure they can't do business anymore.
It's like a PG-13 movie. You're allowed to do it once swear per pod.
Okay. Well, that'll be mine.
So how do we get to Do Not Track though? Like what happened?
Well, so I can give you a very vivid part of this. June 2007, Google announces its intent to buy DoubleClick. It's something I did not do after this. This is the first time and only time I did this. I got called by the New York Times. So, what do you think? And I had and then maintained a principle of we don't get involved in M&A related stuff.
Sure.
It's like not our thing. But they called me and they said, what do you think the implications of this are? And I said, well, I think the implications are that you can protect privacy, but still drive significant amounts of company growth through the use of more mature and innovative uses of data. I wish I hadn't said that. I wish I hadn't said anything at all.
Right.
But it was something that I believed. And so anyway, I think it was the next day, Michael Kasson called me up and just said, by the way, I didn't really know who Michael Kasson was at that point.
Sure.
I had an understanding of it, but he calls me up. He's been hired by Microsoft to try and put the kibosh on the deal, and he wants us to support that. And I said, well, no, we don't get involved in yaying or naying M&A. That's way above our pay grade. That's not, part of what we do, and we're just not going to do it. And he called me every day for about 2 weeks and never seemed to remember from one day to the next the previous conversation. So I knew that this was going to be very, very, very hot button. At one point along the way, to get to the nut of the story, Tim calls me up and said, hey, we're doing a whole industry tour to try and put people's minds at ease, about this deal. We're going to the ANA. Will you come along with us? And I said, I'd be happy to go along just to, validate that you're good citizens of the IAB and good citizens of the industry, which they were. But I'm not going to comment at all on whether I think this is a good deal or not a good deal. I'm just, kind of out of that. So that'd be great if you would come along. So it was Tim, David Rosenblatt, who was the CEO of DoubleClick, and me and a bunch of the ANA folks, Bob Leodis, whom I had known for years and done work with. They were clients of mine at Booz Allen. Dan Jaffe, who was their head of public policy, who I'd known even longer, going back to when I was a New York Times reporter, and others. And it was a perfectly cordial, lovely get-to-know-you meeting. Lasted about half an hour, and that's really all it was get to know you. And at the end of that half hour, Bob says, well, this is, really enjoyable. It was good to get to know you. I think we've kind of covered everything. Is there anything we haven't covered? And I said, yeah, we really need to talk about privacy, because already it had been an issue. I mean,
right.
I don't think I was the one who put it in the New York Times, but that was what Microsoft was using to try and entirely using to block the deal.
Yeah, and as a little background here, DoubleClick had a horrendous privacy PR fiasco more than PR, about 5 years earlier in the early 2000s, where they tried to combine
Abacus. The Abacus
right.
the acquisition totally, blew up in their faces because that was the reason. What's the name of the other? The NAI came into existence,
right?
Because they got warned that you guys are going to kill yourselves unless you get smart about the ways of washing. So importantly, let me just to end the story. So I said, there's real issues about privacy that we need to address. And David Rosenblatt immediately interjected, industry consolidation will take care of that. Now, I knew exactly what David meant. What he meant was that as companies grow larger, they're going to have to be better citizens of the industry in the country. Okay. You can argue that one way or another, but that's what he meant. But then what happened is Dan Jaffe, who'd been the head of public policy for the ANA for, years, immediately kind of stood up and he pointed a finger at David and he said, "Oh, don't you believe that for a minute. Don't believe that for a minute. Nothing is going to take care of this unless you guys take care of it yourselves." And Tim said, "Really? Well, what do you mean? What do you think we should do?" And Dan said, "You ought to get involved with NARC." NARC was the National Advertising Regulatory Council. Anyway, it was a self-regulatory body for advertising. And he said, "You need to self-regulate or you're going to get regulated." And he said, "Get involved with NARC, get involved with the CBBB, the Council of Better Business Bureaus," which is really the leading business self-regulatory body. And that's when it began. That's how, we at IAB joined forces with the ANA and the 4As. We worked long and hard to get the involvement of the Council of Better Business Bureaus. They would only get involved with us if we were really serious about setting up a formal mechanism that would really work to self-regulate the industry. And that's how it began.
Right.
So D&T was itself not necessarily part of that, but is lurking on the edges of that through the entire period. We're trying to create a self-regulatory mechanism that would basically resolve the policy issues and the consumer concerns without creating draconian circumstances that would eliminate, at worst case, or severely limit the value and opportunities of digital advertising.
Right. Yeah. So we'll have to probably have a totally different pod to talk about how that unraveled, because I had no idea how it started. It's really fascinating to find out that the double-click acquisition.
Keep in mind, not only did it not unravel, but we created a self-regulatory mechanism. And that mechanism itself was launched at the White House with the praise and approval of the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce, and the White House itself. So, and it held off any kind of severe regulatory strictures up until today.
Sure. But I mean, on the other hand, the actual technology of Do Not Track was never implemented because of jockeying by Microsoft and other folks. So that kind of was a really good idea that died. And then secondly, it's a pretty strong argument that we would be better off if we had some privacy regulation today.
Oh, without question. I mean, there's a lot of things, but the problem, and, we started having a little bit of this back and forth on LinkedIn yesterday. I'll give you another kind of headline, which also very much relates to this issue. One of the things that I learned about Washington that I didn't actually know in all the years that I'd covered Washington as a journalist is that in many matters, and certainly in matters relating to business regulation, you're dominated by the extremes.
Sure.
And there's an extreme pull in one draconian direction, which then almost requires a counterpull in another draconian direction. Like, turn this into real language. The way we felt legitimately inside the pretty large circle of those of us who are working on this, and we can get to that in a minute, the way we felt was that the opponents were dominated by groups that hated advertising.
Right.
They wanted to eliminate advertising. And by the way, there was a core group inside Microsoft, the Steve Sinofsky browser group, that hated internet advertising.
Right.
They thought it was a blight on the internet and they wanted to elect. So it wasn't just the Google competition that they saw. There was a dominant group in the OS and browser side of that business that hated advertising.
Yeah, I think you could put Apple in that category. I think you could. I think hell, there are some folks at Google who hate advertising if it pays for the free snacks.
Yeah, it's all over. But that was dominant then, and so the counter to that, whereas logically and emotionally, your approach to this, if you're a business person, is let's try and find the common ground so we can protect what needs to be protected and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly.
It's very difficult to do that in Washington policymaking.
All right, I think it's a great place to pause, take a break. We've heard enormous amount of wisdom coming from your history at the IAB. We have a lot of news to talk about. I mentioned earlier Perplexity, but also the Spotify new exchange. So we'll be back in a minute. This podcast is sponsored by Adelaide. You've probably heard of Adelaide by now. This month, they announced a new product, Adelaide for Publishers. For the first time, publishers can leverage attention metrics to curate inventory, deliver attention insights, and drive higher CPMs. Join the Weather Company, NPR, Westwood One, Cumulus Media, and other leading publishers taking advantage of the attention economy's most popular metric, AU. Maybe one day Mark will convince me to sell guaranteed AU slots on Marketecture, but probably not. Check out AdelaideMetrics.com/AFP for more information.
And we're back. Welcome to the news of the week, everyone. We got a bunch of stuff to go through today. We've got Perplexity being sued, Spotify launching an exchange, new vertical ad network. French publishers are mad at Apple, and maybe one bonus to close it out that Ari is very excited to talk about. We'll get it going. So the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, both News Corp properties, are suing Perplexity over copyright. So they're suing Perplexity for copying its news articles, allegedly, and diverting revenue from original publishers. A lawsuit claims that Perplexity reproduces content verbatim and falsely attributes facts to News Corp's outlets. So 2 infractions here. They were warned in July by News Corp. Perplexity did not respond, thus prompting the lawsuit. And the lawsuit seeks to stop Perplexity from using its content and to destroy any databases containing its works. Now, this is a little weird because Perplexity, they've been accused by others of this very thing. They received cease and desist from New York Times, but at the same time, as we've covered on Marketecture, they're also starting to pay some publishers like Time and Fortune. So from my perspective, it seems like they just have a lot going on and they're not quite approaching this in a systematic way. What do you guys think? And particularly for Randall, after Ari goes, your perspective, just having been in the middle of this whole publishing game for as long as anyone. Go ahead, Ari, what's your take?
Yeah, just a fact I didn't know when I first saw this is that News Corp has a license with OpenAI. So they signed a deal with OpenAI.
Correct.
So they're not picking and choosing who to have fights with. But I do think these lawsuits are a form of negotiation where they're not getting the dollar amount they want. There's clearly a liquid market for buying rights. So there's no reason to have a lawsuit unless you're just unhappy with the price. So I think that's really what's going on here.
Good take. R2, what do you think?
Well, yeah, very much agree with Ari. I'll put a little bit more color on it. I think that I know that there's an extraordinary amount of historical dismay in the traditional broad publishing industry that it did not recognize early enough and fight harder and more aggressively against copyright infringement by YouTube and others early on. So this is part of a larger effort to say we're never going to let that happen to us again. It wasn't just copyright. Well, it was copyright theft, product, IP theft in those days. They should have fought harder. So there's that background. And, there's also the background that, News Corp is in, how can I put this delicately? It's a difficult business. It's a non-competitive business. It lagged behind. Many other media companies in adapting to the internet. And this is also, its effort, and we've seen it, across the publishing industry to try and slow down the progress of innovators. And I think there's a third part here as well, just as a kind of a cultural umbrella. Tech bros are now represented by the crypto industry and the AI industry are very much, out of cultural favor. They're kind of the evil enemies of cultural narratives these days. So it's easy to kick them. Why not?
Yeah. For a separate project I was working on, which is hard to explain, I was researching everything that Rupert Murdoch has said about Google over the last 20 years. It was pretty amusing because he's been on Google's ass for the whole time. There are quotes from him in the 90s about Google stealing his content. And then he set the Times of London on YouTube as YouTube supports terrorism. YouTube refuses to remove terrorism stuff. And then the Australian pay-per-click laws. That guy, he's going to live to 110 and he'll still be going after Google at the end.
He's just itching for a fight.
It's the Murdoch Organization, Axel Springer. You can't discount, the importance of the investment they've put in trying to subvert the technology industry. Generally, even as they've tried in fits and starts, Axel Springer arguably more successfully than News Corp in trying to, kind of advance its way in that same industry. So it's intricate and perverse at the same time.
You have to be really dedicated to hating Google to switch to the AppNexus ad server. So that's
it's so fascinating because these LLMs, they're inevitable. They're going to become the way that people interact with the internet. So it's just fascinating to see this game being played out. And Perplexity can't settle with every publisher, nor can OpenAI pay every publisher. So who knows what's going to happen here?
And there are really, really interesting issues here. The obvious one is, the question of what constitutes fair use in an evolving technology. Now, theft is theft. And, if you can prove that stuff is being, taken and returned, like the Google Books settlement going back, years and years ago. A fair use allows you, obviously, to use books and various other forms of publication for research. You can derive stuff from them. You just can't copy them after a certain point. And, arguably the ingesting of whole loads of copyrighted information itself is illegitimate. So this is an important case. And so even if News Corp's self-interest is, self-interested, it doesn't mean it's not a very, very legitimate public policy issue that needs to be addressed, and the courts are a good way to address it in this case.
It's also worth noting that Yelp's complaints about this were dismissed as part of the search antitrust case. So all of their complaints that the Yelp reviews were being used by Google were thrown out. And it was only after that case went to its fruition that Yelp filed a civil suit against Google on the same grounds. But there hasn't been a lot of success in suing Google over their snippets or summary products over the years. So I don't know if this is going to be substantially different. Things like fair use have to do with length as well. Having a couple words is okay, but having a couple sentences is not. So it'll be very interesting to see where this goes.
The key court case, by the way, which is worth reviewing, and I remember it from real time because I was writing for The Nation, was The Nation magazine versus Gerald Ford. It may be Ford v. The Nation is the Supreme Court case. And that's where they kind of established the limits of fair use and put some, pretty severe limitations on it. And that's where it all kind of reverts back to. So I recommend rereading that case.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll read it this afternoon.
Fascinating stuff. All right, let's move on, gents. Spotify is launching an ad exchange and they are partnering with the Trade Desk. So exchange is called the Spotify Ad Exchange, SAX. And it's starting with video ads, not audio ads. TTD is the first partner, focusing initially on North American video ad inventory with audio ads to follow, and will integrate with TTD's OpenPath and UID. Sounds like it's a deep partnership there. And the plan is to expand the business, plans to bring on other DSPs to really open up automated buying here. This is interesting, I think, from two standpoints. Number one, they're not starting with audio, they're starting with video. And specifically not podcast video ads. So I just don't know what the unit of monetization is going to be here. Do you have any clue to that one, Art?
I don't really. It's a little strange. Maybe video being the easy money and audio being a little more challenging to get liquidity. First, I would just want to give them props. We make fun of so many product names on this podcast, but calling it SAX, gets the slow clap.
Yeah.
Gets the slow clap on that.
From the product marketers and us, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and from the guy who guitars in the background is going to be practicing Lester Young's in about 10 minutes. So I approve.
The thing I find a little confusing about this little announcement is it's an exchange, but it's only available on the Trade Desk and it's part of OpenPath. That doesn't compute because OpenPath is not an exchange. OpenPath is when the Trade Desk goes publisher direct.
Yes.
So maybe this is just OpenPath and they're spinning it as an exchange.
Maybe. I think where Spotify is not just a publisher is because they have so many different podcasts, so many different artists, so many different, presumably videos, that perhaps you can think of it as a collection of a whole lot of categories and a whole lot of, sub quote unquote publishers as a result. But I got you there.
Yeah, I think the Spotify strategy has been to use its position as one of the largest audio players. By player, I mean not as a company, but actually physical player. Like the code is Spotify in their app. They control the app. And because audio ads are very difficult to measure and to serve into, they are trying to create a platform for that. So you can host your podcast on Spotify, in which case you get special benefits. You can have better ad serving. So having an exchange is an obvious next step, sort of following the Google playbook a little bit. But with all that said, it's a little disjointed. They're doing like little bits at a time, trying to put together a story here, and it's not as overwhelmingly obvious how advertisers can engage.
Yeah. The one thing that the two of you have vastly more expertise on the details of this and the implications from an ad tech standpoint. But I would just say at a, kind of a super level on this, there are a couple companies out there in the digital media and advertising and distribution industry that are essentially mediums unto themselves, that the company defines the overall medium. Spotify is one of them, primarily in audio, but obviously branching into others. YouTube is obviously another one. That's the easier one to say because YouTube is now the definitive source, the reference source for most human beings for video. It is television.
Right.
And so it looked to me like Spotify, trying to further realize its dominance, that it kind of multimedia, that it doesn't fully represent yet because it's still identified overwhelmingly as an audio company, and that's where its power is. But that looks like it's trying to say we are multimedia.
Yeah.
We, Spotify, are, the moral and functional equivalent of, say, YouTube. How this deal kind of relates to that, as you say, Ari, hard to understand.
Yeah, I'll also just give a shout out to our friends of the pod at Sounds Profitable, which is by far the leading authority in everything audio. So they know a million times more than we do about the audio market if you're actually interested in the subject. So check it out.
Yeah, for sure. That said, this is at the top of Jeff Green's talking points. He doesn't promote every CTD partnership announcement. He rarely promotes them, but he posted on LinkedIn about this one. And, he called it, I'm paraphrasing, digital audio as like the most underpriced opportunity in digital advertising. So, again, TCD needs to show that there's big markets to grow, and there's a real bet on audio for them.
Well, if Jeff wants to come on the pod and defend his investment decisions, we'd be happy to hear from him.
Yes, Jeff. I emailed you this week.
100th episode coming up.
Check your spam. Anyway, all right, we'll move on from audio to retail media. It's got another week, another RMN. Grubhub launched an ads biz. So Grubhub has 28 million users using the service. To give you some context, Uber Eats, who has a very big digital ad business, they have 88 million. So just under half the size of Uber Eats. Similar to Uber Eats in that they're targeting restaurant merchants to help acquire new diners, drive repeat sales. Ads are going to appear in search results, either for specific cuisines or restaurants and on confirmation pages after a sale. They're going to have a self-serve interface for smaller restaurants, and larger ones can use a managed service offering. They're offering credits to kickstart the effort. They plan to expand to non-endemic. So this is the retail media 101 playbook. And I think this is interesting because it's less than half the size of Uber Eats, just under, but I think they've got a clear line to replicate the playbook. The one thing I didn't find was a lot of these RMNs that become successful, they tend to hire either like ed tech or media company leadership to run these divisions. I don't know who's running this at Grubhub and if this is something that is being led from an insider or they've hired up for.
I don't know. I just think I'm amused by it from an historical.
You're amused?
Yeah, I'm amused by it. Just, from an historical sense, I was writing about this kind of thing in the New York Times back in the the late 80s, where every space was becoming invaded by advertising. In those days, it was Whittle Communications doing this kind of stuff, putting ads in gyms and schools and things like that.
Yeah.
So this is I look at retail media networks as a 'twas ever thus phenomenon. Let's fill whatever space we can with promotional advertising. If we own the space, what do we have to lose? And then, collectively you get this kind of overgrazing of the commons, which is, so the public commons gets filled with extraneous advertising and promotions and causes increased advertising and promotions blindness on the part of consumers. So I don't see there really being anything new here other than the technology supports this on behalf of companies that never would have thought of themselves as being advertising distribution channels.
All right, let's do one more and then we'll close it out for the week. And this is one that, Ari, you tracked. So Kevin from The Office was paid by the Kremlin, allegedly, or maybe not allegedly, to record an anti-government ad in Moldova. So Brian Baumgartner, who's, I think, everybody's favorite Office character, got tricked.
I don't know if he got tricked. He was on Cameo, which is the app where you get celebrities to say stuff. And someone paid him to phonetically speak in Russian. They just gave him a script that was in Russian.
Exactly.
And he did it and made his whatever, a couple $100. And it turns out that what he recorded was a message that undermined the government of Moldova to prevent them from, I guess, joining NATO. This is the best story ever.
This is so crazy. So the question is like David Hasselhoff was legendary in Germany and I think, was beloved by the people. Is Brian the same in Moldova? And was this like something that actually affected the election? I'm not trying to make light of it. Like, was he targeted specifically because of this?
Well, I know that The Office is extremely popular around the world. And so many countries actually, this is not that well known, have their own versions of The Office. So there's like an Indian version of The Office with all Indian actors. And there's a Chinese version of The Office with all Chinese actors. And you can find them on YouTube. They're really kind of entertaining. So the real question I have is whether in Moldova, the English version is the popular version, right?
Right.
The only thing that would make this story better is if they had paid some ad tech company to promote this. But as is, it's on the money, chef's kiss story about modern life in 2024.
All right. We should bring it home here.
Yeah.
Randall, thank you so much.
A pleasure, Eric. A pleasure, Ari. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks you so much for giving us all this insight. And Eric, thank you for the news of the week.
Absolutely. We will see everybody same time next week. Until then, take care.
Thanks for listening. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.
Thank you for listening to the Marketecture Podcast. New episodes come out every Friday, and an insightful vendor interview is published each Monday. You can subscribe to our library of hundreds of executive interviews at marketecture.tv. You can also sign up for free for our weekly newsletter with my original strategic insights on the week's news at news.marketecture.tv. And if you're feeling social, we operate a vibrant Slack community that you can apply to join at adtechgod.com.